We haven't been very determinate about exactly what the role of the brain is here, but we've been pushing back against a view which presumes that the brain is issuing orders of some kind. So now we're going to have a quick look at some of the principal parts of the nervous system and their different roles, and also a little bit of what happens when problems emerge there. So there's a brain on the top left. You're looking, the back of the brain is at the left, the front of the brain is at the right. You can see the cerebellum hanging off it, beneath it. The cerebellum is not part of the neocortex. It's a dual hemispheric structure, much older from an evolutionary point of view, clinging onto the base of the brain. It will turn out to be very, very important in stabilizing movement. There is a part of the brain we've met before, the precentral gyrus there, which is the backmost part of the frontal lobe. Contains the primary motor cortex, and we looked at the similarities between it and the postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatosensory cortex earlier on. We saw you may remember these homunculi that we saw there. The primary motor cortex is the point at which long pyramidal cells, these are specific types of neuron in the neocortex, project down through the spinal cord and ultimately out into the periphery. Some of the cells emanating from here have axons that can be more than a foot long, an axon of an individual cell. They are, of course, very, very thin. So the cerebellum, the primary motor cortex, and then there's a third set of structures that we're going to just briefly mention. They are buried deep within the brain. These are also not part of the neocortex. These are collectively known as the basal ganglia. There's very many parts to them. You can see them illustrated in color there. And if we trace these back even from an evolutionary point of view, we have to go back as far as the last common ancestor of the human and the frog to find the point at which the structures of the basal ganglia first enter the record. Now, there's no single simple story to be told here, but each of these three parts plays a specific role in marshalling the parts of the body and coordinating them towards emergent, coherent, fluid patterns of motion. The part that is best known is the primary motor cortex here, and we've seen because the nerves go from here to the periphery, it's often thought of as the point at which volitional action begins in the brain. That is not a good description of this, but the wiring forces us to recognize that this is a part of the neocortex that is very tightly bound to the form of the unfolding of volitional action. And as you can see, we get these characteristic distortions so that the amount of real estate given over to the hands and to the mouth parts in particular are very, very large. And fine manual movements and fine speech movements are sort of our accomplishment as humans. The cerebellum, which hangs off the back, there it is down at the back, it resembles a mini brain all of its own right. When something goes wrong with this, so if something goes wrong with primary motor cortex, we lose, at least transiently, the ability to make volitional movements. When something goes wrong with the cerebellum, we get a particular kind of discoordination, or ataxia, shown here.
Rest tremor and postural tremor is intention action tremor seen with cerebellar disease. In this patient, who has had a traumatic hemorrhage involving one side of his cerebellar white matter pathways, he has a normal function on the right side, but the left side shows significant dysenergia and intention tremor. This type of tremor contrasts, however, with the postural tremor in that both the trajectory and the endpoint are abnormal, and most of this patient's dysfunction is in fact right at the endpoint when he tries to touch his nose or to bring his finger totally out. The trajectory is not normal, but the trajectory is not the area of maximal dysfunction. This type of tremor can also be seen in multiple sclerosis and other primary cerebellar disorders.
So this patient has unilateral cerebellar ataxia, so the effect is only seen on one side of the body. And the manifestation is as dyssynergia, which means the parts aren't functioning together as a coherent whole. So problems with the cerebellum lead to problems with the stabilization of movements, not picking out a trajectory, but stabilizing. It has to do, in other words, with the constraints that keep a precise movement pattern on track. So the primary motor cortex is where we find the closest correspondence between what we understand as volitional movement and action in the brain. Stability of movement and coordination, or synergy, requires a functioning cerebellum as well. What about the basal ganglia? Well, I'm going to say the basal ganglia contain many parts and they play many, many roles in the body. But I'm going to very greatly simplify and suggest that together they don't initiate movement and they don't stabilize movement. But the basal ganglia are responsible for sequencing movement, ensuring that when one part is followed by another part, that happens in this smooth, fluid way that we associate with biological movement. So when there's a dysfunction in the basal ganglia, we get dysfluencies. This is quite common in Parkinson's disease, for example, as illustrated here.
Is the gait that is a hypokinetic gait. The prototype is Parkinson's or Parkinsonian type of gait, in which the patient will have a posture which will be stooped over, leaning forward, and then will have difficulty as far as initiating gait. When the gait is initiated, there are small steps. Oftentimes there's a tremor associated with this. And as the gait progresses, there may be a picking up of speed, or what's called a fenestrated gait. And then in turning, instead of having the normal turning, the patient will turn en bloc, which means they'll turn almost as a statue moving around. And then, again, having difficulty starting in the marche petit pas.
So, you can see that the basal ganglia are clearly important for fluidity, for that smooth linking together of sequences of movements. One way to think about this is the way the role of the conductor in an orchestra. The conductor doesn't have to know how to play the oboe. The conductor doesn't know the fingering on the harp. The conductor's role is to say, you now this strong, you hold back, now come in, now's the time for you to follow. So sequencing and relative intensity, these sort of functions seem to devolve to the basal ganglia. So as you can see, we're only scratching the surface here, but there are different contributions from different parts of the central nervous system to the overall structure of fluid intentional movement. The motor cortex is the principal source of the nerve impulse to the muscle. They're driven, of course, by the whole brain. The cerebellum, responsible for stability and posture and the control of well-learned coordinations. And the basal ganglia for the sequencing and fine-tuning of skilled actions. Now, in discussing the relationship between nervous systems and movement, we focused quite consciously on the simplest form of movement there is, and the first form of movement that ever appeared in the world, which is locomotion, getting around. This is a problem that has been solved in very many ways, and the problems always involve the coordination of paired, oscillating elements. At the other end of the scale of movement are very finely sequenced, complex, non-periodic movements, such as we make with our fingers all the time when you're typing, for example, or in speaking. Remember the homunculus and the primary motor cortex, large areas given over to the hands and to the mouth. Interestingly, the part of the neocortex most closely associated with speaking, Broca's area, is also most closely associated with fine manual movements. So similar strategies seem to be in play here. Speech motor control is interesting to look at in its own right. And here we have jumped away from the simple case of jellyfish motor control, and we're looking at one of the most complex movement problems ever solved by any animal. In speaking, we have a lot of movement, and the movement happens at different time scales. On the one hand, speaking is a form of controlled exhalation, so your breathing matters. You breathe in and then you speak as you're breathing out, thereby slowing the passage of air. And when you run out of air, then you can't speak anymore. And so you breathe in again. So that's a slow rhythm, if you like, each breath lasting more than a second. Then while you're doing that, in the controlled exhalation, you're flapping your meat bits around in your mouth, your tongue and lips and glottis, and well, we'll come to the glottis later, but tongue, lips, the articulators, are making sensitively sequenced, discrete, accurate movements at about 5 hertz, about 5 times a second. When you're speaking, you produce about 5 syllables per second. So that's a very different timescale from the slow timescale of respiration. And then the glottis, so the voice box here, contains the vocal folds, which are vibrating somewhere between 800 and 300 times, 80 to 300 times a second. So a very different timescale again. And somehow we managed to speak. Here I am speaking. I'm totally unfazed by it. And speech is interestingly different from many other kinds of movement that we do in the following respect. The moving parts, those articulators that were flapping around at 5 times a second, and the diaphragm that's moving much more slowly, and the larynx that's flapping much more quickly, they all move in relative isolation from the outside environment. They're all sort of behind the lips. They're all isolated from the world. Now that's quite different from, imagine your movements as you climb a rope or row a boat or dig a hole. Your entire body is coupled to the shovel and the earth, or to the oar and the water, or to the rope. But with speech movement, we get this relatively autonomous form of movement. We've got this complexity of all these time scales, from very fast to quite slow. And the whole system serves to convey discrete information at a very, very high transmission rate. As I said, 5 syllables a second. You can say a lot in that time. Recently, we've developed the ability to look in real time, using magnetic resonance imaging, at the movements of speech. So here's just an example of what you would see if you could see what's going on inside someone as they speak.
You wish to know all about my grandfather. Well, he's nearly 93 years old. He dresses himself in an ancient black frock coat, usually minus several buttons. Yet he still thinks as swiftly as ever. A long flowing beard clings to his chin, giving those who observe him a pronounced feeling of the utmost respect. When he speaks, his voice is just a bit cracked and quivers a trifle. Twice each day he plays skillfully and with zest upon our small organ. Except in the winter.
I'm going to skip forward to see a slightly different style of speech here.
Grandfather likes to be modern in his language. You wish to know all about my grandfather. Well, he's nearly 93 years old.
And so on. Fascinating corpus of emotional speech developed there, but when you see what's going on inside your mouth as you speak, you might be somewhat taken aback. The tongue looks nothing like the little bit of the tongue that can protrude. It's this enormous organ that's moving up and down and back, particularly. Speech raises lots of puzzles, and here's one that I found myself in my own work. This is an interesting puzzle that causes us to ask questions of control and coordination. And you only find it in the case where you have 2 people reading in synchrony with one another. I've called this kind of speech synchronous speech, and what I do is I get 2 people into the lab and give them a text to read, say, please read this in synchrony, 3, 2, 1, go. It sounds like this.
There is, according to legend, a boiling pot of gold at one end. People look, but no one ever finds it. When a man looks for something beyond his reach, his friends say he's looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
They can do it. They are really good at it. Nearly everyone is really good at it. This is a really easy thing to do. But given the complexity that we just saw, it's kind of amazing that these two individuals, each of whom has a highly plastic voice that responds sensitively to who they're talking to, where they're talking to, what the surroundings are, each of them can limit that complexity and become, as it were, one unit. So the synchrony here is very, very tight. They're usually with no more than about 40 milliseconds off. There's no periodic basis for this. And so this poses something of a puzzle. How do people maintain this extraordinarily tight synchrony under these situations? Well, when you do experiments like this, sometimes they show you something surprising. And there's an error that we find that arises only under these conditions. It doesn't arise under any other conditions. And that error is that two people suddenly stop speaking together at exactly the same moment, as if they were mown down by the same train. What this illustrates is that the two speakers are not separate from each other. It's not the case that I'm controlling my body and you're controlling your body, and I'm trying to figure you out and you're trying to figure me out. Notice that many of the approaches in social cognition pose the question in exactly that way. Rather, what we see is that we become entangled, non-separable from each other, in a manner that might seem familiar to you from, let's say, the three-legged race. In a three-legged race, we literally tie two people together so that they're not independent of each other. And under these constrained circumstances, you can still run. But you all know what happens when you run in a three-legged race. Well, what quite likely happens is this. You go down. Because two people running together are coupled together, and that makes them somewhat less stable, so that one person falling will bring the other one down. Well, we find a remarkable analogue of this in the lab when we get two people to speak together. Here, I'll play you an example.
Big dinosaurs and bigger dialects in battle. Big dinosaurs and bigger dialects in battle. Big dinosaurs and bigger dialects in battle. Big dinosaurs and bigger dialects.
They just stopped at the same time and fell apart, usually with laughter. Just to show him that wasn't a fluke, here's one more example. People are reading word lists.
Shady, final, patter, folly, bingo,
But
sorry.
They both stop in mid-syllable, as if a bullet had taken them down. What this illustrates is that under these circumstances, the two people are absolutely not independent of each other. They are coupled in a very, very literal sense. So there's an awful lot to think of here. And then when people synchronize, there's a lot of very interesting stuff happens. So I'm going to wind up here. We've taken a very, very wide journey through all kinds of landscapes. There have been certain tensions, certain contrasts that have been with us the whole way. Cognitive science, in investigating the relationship of the knower and the known, or looking at the knowing relationship, faces certain deep problems, and these are not problems to be overcome. They are problems that we must bear in mind as we address such questions. So distinctions, such as the physical versus the mental, cannot be taken at face value. They cannot be regarded as simple ways that the world decomposes. Rather, the availability of frameworks in which the physical is cast as one thing and the mental is cast as another need to be set beside ones that refuse such division. So the physical mental is not to be overcome and not to be solved. We've seen the same tension between the rationalist concerns with intellect, abstract thought, innate ideas, pure certainty and truth, and the empiricist concern with exposure to the world, interaction with the world, evidence of the senses, grounding in the body. Neither of these is going to go away, and these are not football teams. Rather, approaching questions in cognitive science requires you to keep such concerns in mind. There's been a huge tension about just what we devolve to the individual and what we attribute to a collective. We saw that most fluidly just there with the dolphins. We saw this intensely in the section on social psychological studies. Any determinate account of what the individual is seems to create a an epiphenomenal domain called the social. And yet we cannot understand ourselves without regarding ourselves as necessarily involved in collective activities with collective goals producing collective effects as well. So these tensions will never go away. The distinction between control and coordination is something we've invested quite a lot of time in. Again, emphasizing that different perspectives allow you to construct carefully different stories, but you must keep those perspectives, the limitations of any individual perspective in mind. We've contrasted in a broad sense computational accounts from embodied accounts. This maps almost exactly onto the rationalist empiricist concerns. That's where a lot of current debate in cognitive science is. Behind all this is a notion of the person. Now, in some of these frames, we may describe the person as a problem solver, or we may describe the person as an organism, or we may describe the person as a component in an emergent pattern. I want you to understand that as we discuss minds, bodies, and the human world, this notion of the person needs to be sort of non-finalized. Because these questions don't have answers, but rather serve to alert us to the advantages and limitations of any framework we care to adopt, there is an ethical need not to consider the person as being fully described within any one framework. Any attempt to do so will meet with opposition and will be contested, because I can't tell you who you are and you can't tell me who I am. So I will encourage you, when you read many different accounts of the person, to realize that the person is not being described, rather a projection, an aspect, a caricature of some feature of the person may be describable within one framework or another. The person itself must be sort of regarded as something we're going to have to discuss together. And I think that's a good point to end this section and this course on. I hope you enjoyed the course.